A shape, D chord, pentatonic, and major scale position 5, or A shape, D chord, pentatonic, major scale position. Get ready, because it's time to rock and or roll. Here we are in our worksheet, remembering that we have the top string on top, that being the low or heavy E, the string closest to the ceiling, the high string on the bottom, the one closest to the floor, the 0 representing the open fret, the one that we would not be fingering if indicated, meaning we would just be ringing it out open. Frets 1, 2, 3, 4, the ones that we would be fingering if indicated, indicated here by the orange items on down below. We are now looking at the A shape and the D chord position. Let's go through what we have in the open position that we looked at in prior presentations. Here's our A shape in the open position. Whenever we call something an A shape, we want to think about it in the open position so that when we move it up, we can still refer to it as some other chord, even though we can refer to it as an A shape. We're going to be looking at that open item. It's open here when we're looking at the A, that open A string that's going to give us our root, because we want to be memorizing these top two strings, and as we move it up, we want to be looking at that string to let us know what we are playing. If we move it up here, for example, we would now be at the B, which is a very common variant that would be a useful tool to have. Now, when we are fingering in the open position, we might be putting our smallest fingers down here. For example, we would not need to finger these items because they would be ringing out in the open position. However, if we were to move it up, say to the B, as we saw last time, then it's very common that you want to play the full chord, bar chord here in essence, by putting your pointer finger here and possibly your ring finger down here. Some people might use their pinky in order to bar that off. That's going to be a very common position that you would want to use. But even if you move your fingers up in the same position, just having these three chords that you're playing out, possibly just with your index finger, that'd be the easiest thing to do. And then you still want to be looking back to this note, because that's going to tell you what chord it is that you are playing. You have a B here as well. You have the A here as well. You could say that tells me what I'm playing too. It does, but you probably don't know the numbers on these strings, or the letters on this G string as well as you do on the A string. So I would then try to use these top two as an anchor so that you can basically then see what you're playing a little bit more clearly. It'll be a little bit easier to kind of figure out most of the time. So then if we scroll down, we're now moving it up. We're moving it up to the D now. So we have that same A shape that we're in the D. Once again, quite common to use the full D chord, which means you'd put your pointer here, repositioning your fingers, putting your ring finger here, or some people might be using their pinky to put over here. You're typically not going to be ringing out in that instance the bottom E, and you've got a nice movable shape. However, the point of moving up isn't just so you have a different voicing of the D shape, although that's useful. This is a useful bar chord, because if you're playing some other voicing, basically if you're just playing in bar chords, then this will be easier to play than jumping down to an open D. But you also have a whole lot of other voicings that can be constructed from this voicing. You can play other variants of the chord. You can also basically use it as an anchor to tell you where you are in the positioning of the guitar. So let's take a look at our theory just to take a look at the D. So if we're playing D major and we just pulled in our notes in the scale from D to D and just did our whole half type of thing, we would have D to E, whole step to F sharp, half step to G, whole step to A, whole step to B, whole step to C sharp, and then a half step back home to D. So our scale in the key of D would be D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, D. And then if we just took the 1, 3, 5, we would have the D, F sharp, and the A. So our position here should have Ds, F sharps, and As. As we can see here, we got the D. That's what we'd be pointing to. That would be our root if we were doing like a bar chord on it. And then we've got the A. We got another D. There's our F sharp. And there's another A on down below. So we could do different variants of that in order to voice out the chord in different ways. Let's add the pentatonic to it. So if I unhide some cells over here, we're going to unhide some cells. Take a look at the pentatonic. And so now we can voice, this is our shape that has our A chord shape in it, but now has 5 notes on the pentatonic scale, which you could call, it's going to be an A shape. if it was in the open position, A shape D chord, because your fingers, the root is right there in the D, pentatonic position, even though there's 5 notes, because now, and the chord has 3, because you're using the chord to position yourself around the shape that is the relative pentatonic position. So you could call it that. You could say, okay, this is going to be an A-shaped chord, A shape in the open position, A-shaped chord that is in the key of D, because there's my root, so I know it's in the key of D, pentatonic position, which means I'm adding 2 other notes around it that are the other 2 notes that fulfill the D pentatonic scale. So that's going to, and then you can use those other notes, of course, to try to accentuate the actual chord differently. If you'd like to try to add those positions in there to try to do different voicings and fingerings of the chords. And then, of course, you can use this to then play along with a song, arpeggiating the chord and then reaching out to the other notes in the scale to accentuate it. And if you're playing in the key of D, the song in the key of D, then you want to basically be playing around the Ds. And if you use them as basically the home base so that you always get back to it from time to time, then that's one way that you can play around. You can also basically see you've got this open D right there. So if you're playing these 2 Ds together, if you're fingering this chord in this open D, that's a nice fingering, because then if you're playing in a song of the D, you're always going back home with this open, this open D string right there. You can always look back here and see you got your D, you've got your open A that are fitting in here, and the E and the high E, all these open strings that could help you to accentuate whatever you're doing. So whenever you're playing, you kind of want to see, can you fit in the open position as well to whatever you're doing, either in a chord or possibly in your picking or whatever you're doing. So if I then go over and we're going to say, let's add the major then, the major positions. So now we can call this, we could say, okay, now this is now an A shape. This is an A shape that that would be an A shape in the open position, A shape in the open position, D chord, because my finger's pointing to the root note of the D, and then it would be D chord major scale having 7 notes in it, the actual chord only having 3. But you can see how that can help you to see where you are. So you can say, okay, it's an A shape if I was in the open position, D chord, because now the root's at the D, major scale, which has 7 notes and not 3. But what I'm saying is this position, which I know what it is because I'm pointing at the D and I know it's an A shape, is inside the major scale, which I'm going to visualize around it, adding the notes of the major scale, and then of course gives you a nice movable thing to reference yourself. So when you're playing along with a song, you'd like to be playing along first, possibly with the arpeggios, doesn't have to be in order, something in the scale, and then accentuating going on beyond that to the pentatonic scale, and then you can add the other couple notes for the major scale, and that's a systematic way that you can get a little bit more complex and add more options to it. If we go back to then our information over here, the whole scale is going to be in a major scale for the key of D, D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, and then back to D. If we numbered it, we'd go 1 through 7, starting back at 1. If you were playing chords for the D, for D, then you would typically be using a major D, a minor E, minor F sharp, major G, major A, minor B. You typically will drop, most people will, the diminished, and that's what you would have. So then you'd often see you could start off with the D, G, A, the 1, 4, 5, really common kind of progression, which is nice to play, especially since, again, you got that kind of open D right there that can basically help you to kind of root yourself in the D. You could do that by playing this scale around it, arpeggiating pentatonic to the major, or you can move the positions as we've seen, moving up, trying to follow along with the song as it moves through the 1, 4, 5.